mentioned, like housing sizes and planetary scale or planetary borders, boundaries, and also the shrinking, the necessity to shrink in terms of housing sizes. So that's going to be my topic today. But before going to the shrinking of the housing, I would like to say a few words about expanding housing, because that's what we have been experiencing until now. So here what you can see are the areas, floor areas of housing per dwelling in this upper panel and per person. So here, as you can see, each line corresponds to a single country. These are European countries. But mind you, more or less same picture I would have obtained if I plotted here countries from other continents. Green is Germany, is we're in Germany, and it's probably more interesting to see what happens here. And you see that in most of these countries, there's an upward trend. So the size of housing increased tremendously between 1960s and 2020s. For example, in Germany, the average average dwelling increased from 60 square meters to 94 square meters. In case of housing per capita, the increase was even bigger. It's almost tripled, so from 20 square meters to about 50 square meters. So that's what happened across many countries for many decades. And the main reasons are that first, more housing was built and people arrived, and arrived by right, I mean not only from other places, but also to the world. So the increase of the population in these countries. And another factor was the growing size of the newly built housing. So each year, the average size of the new completions was higher on average than in the previous year. And that's what I'm going to illustrate now. So the first figure is for West Germany, because we have for West Germany the longest time period, observations with the longest time series. So here I start in 1961. I set this to 100%, and so that we can see the development, the evolution of population size and of housing stock. And we see here that the population increased by less than 20%, while housing stock more than doubled. Same thing occurred in other countries. For instance, I looked also numbers for France, and I can imagine that the same maybe with a different scale, but same type of development happened also in the UK and in Brazil and in many other countries, which we represent here. So talking about new housing construction, here we can see 6 different countries, 6 selected countries. I could have shown more countries, but of course it would make this picture even less visible. Because even with 6 countries, I think it's too much. But anyway, these are the countries that have the longest time series period. And what we see is that up to a certain point, there was an upward trend of the floor area of the newly built housing. So, for example, here we have Denmark, and we start in 1940, I think, and at that time the average newly built house or dwelling was roughly 90 square meters, then it increased to 150. In Belgium it went up from 120 to 200. In Germany from 70 square meters to 120 square meters. So you see that in all these cases we have an upward trend. Of course it's interrupted from time to time. We have some fluctuations. These are most likely the fluctuations related to the housing cycle, as we'll see later on. And then something happened. So in all these cases, after kind of peak was attained, the average newly built area of housing started to fall. We see it in all these cases. It happened to different time points. So, for example, in Belgium and Japan, it happened in 1999. And then in Denmark and Ireland, it happened after the Great Recession, 2008-2009. Well, so this process was taking place within one good decade. To some extent, it's also related, the difference in this timing is related to the indicators that we use to measure the housing construction activity, because this is different in different countries. For example, for Belgium, Ireland and Germany, the building permits are used to measure housing construction. For Japan, it's building starts, and for Denmark, Germany and Russia, it's completions. Of course, completions, they take place later than building permits, and when we use building permits, then we'll see the change in the trend a bit earlier. For example, here for Germany, it happened a couple of years earlier than the peak for completions was achieved. But anyway, we have here a change, a structural break, I would say, that will probably have implications for the nearest future of the housing market. Now, why it happened? Why the housing sizes started to decline? Newly built housing sizes started to decline. Well, here I would propose two major factors which are actually interrelated. The first factor is that household sizes decline. And by the way, why it is important, because you could see that we have quite a heterogeneous panel of countries. So we have Germany, we have Japan, we have Russia, so pretty different countries in terms of their socioeconomic characteristics. But the thing which is common for them is the decline in the new construction sizes. So we must look in the factors that are common for all these countries. So one of these factors is the demography, and in particular the shrinking household size. Well, for most of you, or for all of you, I think it's not something surprising. So you perfectly know that the households sizes have been decreasing. So from the beginning of 19th century towards now, we have a decrease from 5.5 to 2.5 persons per household. That's the average household size. Germany, by the way, is here as probably one of the lowest household sizes, with 2 persons per household. Why it happened? Well, first of all, because of the declining fertility, so we simply have less children than our grandparents, so that therefore the household size is smaller, but also because of the tendency toward loneliness. So more and more people live alone. So it's not only elderly women who lost their partner, but it's also younger people. And we can see it here in the lower panel, which shows the proportion of single-person households in the total number of households. And we see that about 120 years ago, there were less than 10% of such households. Now we have 35-40% of such households nationwide. And in cities, for example, in Germany, big German cities like Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, and so on, they have more than 50% of households represented by single persons. So I don't know whether it's something that they choose themselves or they are forced to live alone. That's also an interesting question, and of course there's research on this topic, but this leads to declining household sizes, and coupled with increasing, until now, sizes of housing, this leads to a disproportion, to a mismatch between the household size and dwelling sizes. So what we see here, this is a picture for Germany. So we have here the distribution of households and dwellings by size. For example, the green line corresponds to households. We see that one-person households represent more than 40%, two-person households represent roughly 35%. Bigger households are less than 5% of the total number of households. By contrast, if we take the distribution of dwellings, then we'll see just the opposite. We see that there are relatively very few dwellings with just one room, and 40% of dwellings which have 5 rooms and more. So it means that we have a gap between increasingly large number of small households and small number of small dwellings. Okay? So that even if the number of dwellings is equal to the number of households, we can still, so arithmetically we have balanced housing market. Even in this case, we can still have an over demand of housing in this segment of small dwellings. And this, of course, can lead to and leads to price increases and rent increases, and that also can be an incentive for the investors, for the builders to construct dwellings that are smaller. And that probably was the trigger for the structural break that we observed. So the builders, they started to react finally to the reality, to the fact that household sizes are very small now. So that's one factor. Another factor is the price factor. So I already mentioned that we see that the average size of the newly built housing is, or used to be, upward trended. Then it, from certain point in the past, it started to be downtrended. But there are also some cyclical fluctuations that are overimposed on these trends. And my idea is that it's related to the housing bubble and bust cycles. For example, here we have data for Germany. This is the price to rent ratio, which is used typically to measure the booms and busts in the housing market. So when the housing prices are increasing faster than rents, then we have this indicator increasing, and this points out to a boom being built up, or even speculative price bubble. And on the other hand, we have a share of dwellings in multi-family houses, or apartments, if you wish, flats and apartments. Why it's important? Because we know that, and I will show you also some figures on this, that these flats and apartments are usually much smaller than the single-family houses, or terraced houses, semi-detached houses. So when the proportion of apartments increases, then the average area of the newly built housing decreases too. This is, by the way, the share of dwellings in multifamily houses in the completions, not in the total housing stock. And you see that although the correlation is not perfect, we still can observe some relation between these two curves. So when the price to rent ratio goes up, the share of dwellings in multifamily houses increases. And this also happened during the latest housing price boom in Germany, but also in other countries. So the idea is that, well, that when the prices go up, for example, prices of land go up, so say in Berlin, like 15 years ago, you could buy a plot of land for 200 euros per square meter. Now it's more than double of that. And of course, if you wanted to buy, if you wanted to build a single-family house on the same plot of land, with the price doubled, you would better build a semi-detached house with 2 families, so that you can neutralize the effect of increasing the land prices. Or you can even, for example, build a multi-family house with many stories, with many housing units, so that you can also benefit from the price increases, because now you can earn more money for the same building plot area. And therefore, these conducts to the increasing proportion of the multifamily for the dwellings in the multifamily houses. I also observed it actually in my area, in my neighborhood, where the building firm that was building housing there densified. As the prices increased, they densified the construction. So in the beginning they said, okay, here we'll build a couple of single-family houses, and then in the end they ended up with terraced houses, with 3 terraced houses here, double house here. So instead of 3 units, they built finally, I think, how many? 3 plus 2 plus 1, 6 housing units. And it's more than it's doubling of the initial plans. We also see that, and this contributes also to the proportion of the multifamily housing in the housing constructions. We see that as the cycle or as the boom progressed, the investors were building larger and larger multifamily houses. So here we have the number of housing units per building. So they started in 2004 with 7.2 dwellings per building, and then they ended up with almost 11 dwellings per building in 2024. So it's a huge increase, I should say. And if you have more multifamily houses being built, and these houses are becoming bigger in terms of the number of units they contain, then of course the proportion of the multifamily units increases in the total supply of the new housing. And another thing, which I already mentioned, is the difference in the size. So here we have buildings with 1 dwelling or detached houses. Here we have semi-detached houses, and these are the multifamily houses. And you can see that already this is the share, and not the share, that's the floor area in square meters, an average. So you see that, for example, in the end of the sample, the average area of detached houses was like 150 square meters. And for apartments in multifamily houses, it's just 75 square meters, so half of the size of a single-family house. That's the first difference. And the second interesting fact is that the dynamics are also different. So while the average size of the newly built detached houses keeps increasing, it started to stagnate in case of semi-detached houses, and already in 2015 it went down in case of apartments and flats. So you see that it went from 80 square meters to perhaps 70 square meters per, or 75%. So I don't have to contradict myself. So, and this of course also further contributes to the declining area of the newly built housing. So we have increasingly more units in multifamily housing, which is already pretty high in Germany, because if I have some numbers I want for the distribution of, or average size of, a proportion of multifamily houses in different countries, and in Germany it's already pretty high, so much higher than, for example, in the UK or in Ireland. And this share is increasing even more, so more and more units in multifamily houses are being built. And these units are becoming even smaller than before. So that's perhaps the tendency that we'll face in the nearest future. So I predict that in the next few years it will also reflect in the average size of dwelling in the housing stock. So not only in the new housing supply, but also in the existing housing stock. So that the housing stock adapts, or started to adapt, to the shrinking household sizes. More than that, the housing stock is not only becoming smaller, it also becomes older. So like we people, houses are also aging, and it's interesting that these processes are going hand in hand, as you will see later on. Why old housing can be a problem? By the way, here you have two pictures, one taken by me in Zagreb, and that's a picture taken by a friend of mine, Dirk Ulbricht, in Germany, in East Germany. So perhaps you don't see here is a shield for sale. So I can imagine that you can buy this house for a very low price, but I don't think you would like to do it, because it's this little town is full of houses like this. So it's a dying town. So why old house can be a problem? Well, because you need to spend more money on renovation of it. I think you've been busy renovating a house in Finland, so you know it perfectly well how expensive and time-consuming can it be. These houses consume more energy, and in many cases they offer less comfort than newly built houses. For example, they lack elevators or barrier-free dwellings for elderly and for disabled people. If we look at the median age of housing over time, then we'll see the following picture. So these are different countries in Europe. This is Germany, and not only in Europe, it's actually worldwide. It's the data that I was able to collect in the last few months. And what you see is that in the beginning of the sample, the housing age was even higher than in the end. So when it was in the late 50s, early 60s, and the reason for such an old housing stock was, of course, that in the interbellum period, so between two world wars, there was little construction, there was a Great Depression at that time, then the country started to prepare for the war, then there was a war when more houses were destroyed than built, and then immediately after the war there were not enough resources to build, therefore only older houses were left, and each year they became even older. So that the median age of housing went up to very high level. And then in the 60s and 70s, a very active process of construction started, which happened in virtually all countries in Europe. In Germany, for example, they used to construct up to 700 or 800,000 units a year. Now it's 250, at most 300,000 units a year. While the population, recall that the population increased by 20%. So now we have a larger population and twice as, or half as few completions. So this process of active construction plus another process of active demolishment led to juvenilization, so to speak, of the housing stock. The housing stock became much younger, as you can see here. By the way, a few words about demolishment. I think it was a kind of fashion, because in Berlin, for example, now in Berlin, whole quarters were demolished. These were nice houses, but from the point of view of those times, they didn't represent too much worth, because they were lacking basic sanitary equipment, for example, no toilets, or at least no indoor toilets in the apartments, no bathrooms, no elevators. So the idea was to demolish them and replace them by nice concrete buildings that have all the modern equipment. Fortunately, not all of this was demolished. But anyway, this also contributed to the decrease in the median age of the housing. And then after the 90s, we have a decrease in the construction rates, and this, of course, leads to a gradual increase in the median age of the housing. So now we have housing which is between 40 and 60 years old in many European countries. Just a comparison across cross country borders. So here I have a map of median ages. The darker the color, the higher the median age. The yellow color means that I don't have data for these countries. And we see that the oldest housing stock is concentrated in Europe, especially in Switzerland, in Sweden, in the UK, and Denmark. Next, so in the US, for example, the houses are also pretty old, but not that old as in Europe, so like 45 years median age. In Africa, as far as we have data for these continents, the dwellings are much younger. Interestingly, the age of housing is correlated with the age of population. Okay? So here we have different points which correspond to different countries. This is the 45-degree line. Probably you don't see it from behind. But anyway, so you can see that there's a positive relation. Here we have the median age of people, here we have the median age of housing, and the older the population, then the older the housing stock. Although you have here some exceptions. For example, these are the European countries that I already mentioned. For example, Switzerland, Sweden, Great Britain, Denmark, and Belgium that have very old housing stock. It's much older than the population in those countries, so like a generation older than the population. By contrast, you have here, you see also that the colors are different, and this corresponds to the income, to the GDP per capita. So these are the poor countries with young housing stock. These are the rich, old countries with old housing stock. But still you have here, for example, Korea, South Korea and Japan, that are rich countries, very old countries, with a relatively young housing stock. So their population is 45, 50 years old, while the housing stock is just 25 years old. Another interesting example is China, where the population is relatively old compared to the poor countries, but the housing stock is very young. So in China, in case of China, I can explain it by a very active construction rate, which took place in the last 3 to 4 decades. In case of Japan, I can also at least try to explain it with some cultural things like and climatic things. So in Japan, as in many other countries, they used to build housing using wood, and the climate there is very humid, so after 20 years, the best thing you could do with the house was to demolish and to build a new one, because it was completely rotten. And now it doesn't really work because you have most of the housing is built of concrete, so it's not that much subject to the climatic conditions, but another explanation is the seismic activity. So there are very frequent and very strong earthquakes there. So perhaps they prefer to build housing of some in such a way as it's easy to be demolished and rebuilt after a devastating earthquake. So in any case, interesting. I mean, because Korea is also in the same group of the countries. So somehow these southeastern or probably far eastern countries are specific in this respect. And then, given that there is a correlation between the housing size, between the housing age and population age, you can think that there is also correlation or similarity in the age distribution of these two things. So here I try to plot the kind of age pyramid. You know, this age pyramid that is typically used for demography, for population structure. Well, this is Germany, therefore it's not a pyramid, it's rather an onion, or some different form, but anyway, here you have the population, so males and females taken together by ages, and here you have the pyramid. I will still use this word pyramid, although it's not pyramid at all anymore, for the housing stock. And you see that there is striking similarity. Of course, you have these outliers, very old housing, because housing has a much longer lifespan than people. But I think it's very striking. Here I also put the number of birth and the number of completed housing units. And again, you see that there's a pretty strong correlation between each of these numbers. So it leads me to the idea that perhaps there's a correlation between births and constructions. So not between the increase in the population, but between birth and construction. And interestingly, I thought I discovered something new. So it was a breakthrough, but then I found in the literature that there was a French demographer, Louis Andy, who already in the 60s discovered this correlation between the age structure of population and the age structure of housing. But still, I think it's interesting. And then, if we want to really see a pyramid, then we should better go to Egypt. And there, indeed, it's a pyramid. It's a country of pyramids, not only these ancient pyramids, but also population age pyramid is really looks like the pyramid, and the housing has exactly the same structure. Well, there are some. Here, for example, this bar is a bit longer, meaning that they built, in the last 2 decades, they built more than people were born, implying that the housing conditions in Egypt improved over the last decades. But anyway, they have very similar structure, and they have relatively few old housing. Mind that I'm talking about housing, not about pyramids. So this is residential. These are residential buildings. So completely different structure of population and completely different structure of houses. And now we are coming to the final slide. So what can we learn from these statistics, from this evidence? First of all, the 20th century saw a revolution in terms of quality, in particular in terms of size. So we tremendously improved our housing conditions. We live nowadays in more comfortable and spacious homes than our parents and grandparents. But it appears that we are the generation that found itself in the times of transition. Okay, according to ancient Chinese, that's the worst time to live in, and we landed exactly in that time. So we are at the point when some saturation was achieved, so there's no way of further improvement. For example, in terms of housing stock, so we'll face the declining size of housing consumption, and the double aging that we observed. So both people and housing are aging will not help to improve this situation, because we have already very old housing stock and very old infrastructure. And I don't know about your countries, but in Germany, I think every month, more or less, we get news about another bridge which is about to crumble or crumbled, fortunately without human victims, or is going to be demolished, because otherwise it's going to crumble in the next at some unexpected moment. And now imagine that we have the most numerous generation, the cohort of baby boomers that is exiting the labor market. So who is going to renovate, to maintain this huge infrastructure, including housing stock in the next 20 years? So we are going to get older, in the older housing, which is not getting better, but other way around, with less labor force. And already there are some publications on smart shrinking. So we are not talking about expanding, but about shrinking. Well, it's a fancy term to denote this sad transition toward older people, even older people, and older housing stock and older structures in general. And although it's a pretty tragic note, I will finish here. And here, If you wish to watch some other videos on housing conditions, then you are welcome to do it on my little YouTube channel. So thank you very much for your attention.